My second guest is Pablo Ignacio Jiménez. He will start in a minute with the first presentation. Pablo Jiménez has a master's degree in sociology at the Benemérita Universidad Autónoma de Puebla and is a teacher of history and social science. His main research interests are related to radical social criticism, new readings of Marx, and the critical analysis of contemporary social struggles in the context of the capitalist crisis. Some of his writings and translations can be found on a NEC Plus Ultra website. We will link them on our homepage. And Pablo is joining today from Chile. And I welcome you with great gratitude. Let's start with your input, Pablo.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks to everyone. Hi. First, I would like to thank you for your presence here because what we are going to discuss, the social and ecological crisis of capitalist civilization, is a problem that seriously affects the whole of humanity. Consequently, reflecting together on this important issue is already an act of hope that shows that things can be different. To analyze the current crisis, I would like to discuss the concept of the Dark Enlightenment. Wait me a minute, I have a PPT for you. Thank you. This is the title of my presentation. I would like to discuss the concept of the Dark Enlightenment and propose the following central thesis. Today, we are in a new historical phase of the crisis of global capitalism. One of the paradigms of this new stage of capitalism is Gaza. In this sense, today, we should reverse the famous quote from Das Kapital that says that the most advanced countries show the others their future. Today, it is in the brutalities that occur on the peripheries of the system that advanced nations find the picture of their own future. In Gaza, the contradictory nature of the development of productive force of capital is manifested in this way. Increased production capacity is simultaneously increased capacity for destruction. Let us analyze then the concept of the Dark Enlightenment. As you are surely aware, Donald Trump's recent second ascension to the highest power in the United States has been supported by a rising neo-reactionary movement that has grown stronger during and after the uprising over the murder of George Floyd, the largest riot in US history. This neo-reactionary movement is a true disaster nationalism, characteristic of the socio-ecological crisis of global capitalism. This disaster nationalism openly states its delusional political goals and is a clear symptom of the objective tendencies of the current historical phase of capital and the far-reaching social transformation unfolding with this process. Indeed, however insane the public intervention of figures such as Javier Milei, Alice Weidel in Germany, Elon Musk, or Donald Trump may seem to us, the truth is that through their actions and consciousness, they embody the objective needs of the present historical stage of late capitalism. Hegel, when he saw Napoleon pacing with his troops outside his house in Jena, reflects on the historical universal implication of the concentration of an entire historical process in a single man who, sitting on his horse, intervenes in the war and dominates it. Today, we could say that the true historical universal image that sums up Our present are the fascist gesture of Elon Musk, the richest capitalist on earth, during Trump's imperial rise and carpet bombing of Gaza. We have seen the spirit of the war through our screens rise to power surrounded by the most powerful human beings who have ever existed, talking about achieving their manifest destiny by sending their companies to colonize Mars, while our own planet is turned into a desert. But we have also seen them vaporize thousands of the most dispossessed people in this world with the help of the most advanced force of industry. The terrible picture that results from the fusion of these two images give us an accurate diagnosis of the current state of humanity, organized under the rational social form of capitalism, but also of what the future will be like in the new historical phase of the global crisis of capitalist civilization that is now emerging. Therefore, this historical process must be understood as a moment in a broader systemic process, the converge of technological acceleration, the objective trend toward the decomposition of labor as the foundation of capitalist society, the accelerated destruction of nature that is inherent to the acceleration of capital, and the rise of a new and openly authoritarian political forms in the context of the crisis of this civilization. I will now present the thesis that Trump's rise is a key moment in the transition to a new historical phase of the crisis of global capitalism, whose fundamental characteristics were foreseen, albeit in a distorted way, by neo-reactionary philosophy and cataloged under the label of Dark Enlightenment. I will adopt the use of this term in a sense that subverts the neo-reactionary idea and integrates it into a critical analysis that seeks to develop its important moment of truth. The Dark Enlightenment is a concept in neo-reactionary philosophy first developed by Curtis Yarvin and later expanded by Nick Land. The former, Yarvin, is an American software engineer, businessman, and blogger who began his work producing and disseminating neo-reactionary ideas under the influence of PayPal co-founder Peter Thiel, a close friend of Elon Musk. Unlike the traditional Silicon Valley elite of the time, Yarvin and Thiel were opposed to the basic tenets of neoliberal governance that characterized the traditional American Reich. For his part, Nihlan continued to develop accelerationist philosophy after leaving his job as a university professor in England and settling in Shanghai. Given his extensive initial philosophical training and his knowledge of the theories of Deleuze and Guattari, he was able to develop a synthesis between Yarvin's neo-reactionary ideas and accelerationist readings of Marx works, mediated by the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and postmodern critiques of late capitalism under the title The Dark Enlightenment. This work is the most complete compendium of neo-reactionary philosophy. The Dark Enlightenment, as a concept, designates the affirmation of a perverse or dark legacy of the modern Enlightenment that has been denied by democratic progressive philosophy and a particular proposal for the future of capitalist civilization that openly embrace a dystopian historical drift. If one were to ask what characterizes neo-reactionary too, one could respond in general terms. In general terms, that is an acritical glorification of the technological acceleration of capitalism, a vindication of so-called human biodiversity, a pseudo-biological form of postmodern racism, the proclamation of the right to secession as a fundamental right alongside private property, a visceral rejection of any form of political correctness and progressive egalitarianism, and a proposal for corporate administration of the state with marked tones of social Darwinism, known as neocameralism. Neocameralism, as proposed by neo-reactionary philosophy, will consist of corporate management of the state, which will be administered like a joint stock company and led by a CEO. Needless to say, in such a concept of government, a technologically maximizes police force at the service of protecting capitalist order is essential. This anti-democratic perspective is a common feature of neo-reactionaries. Curtis Jerven even claimed that neo-reactionaries should not even engage in any kind of propaganda for the collapse of the current democratic state in the USA, because democracy will implode due to its own intrinsic contradiction as an inefficient administration of capital subject to increasing entropy. In a more sophisticated line of argument, Nick Land urged that the techno-economic acceleration of capital will necessarily lead to the suppression of democracy and its replacement by corporate government. In this regard, he points out that in countries such as China and Singapore, this type of government is already practically a reality, indicating that it is an intrinsic trend of technological acceleration in the context of the crisis of late capitalism. As I have already mentioned, Trump's rise goes hand in hand with a cabinet of billionaires led by Elon Musk. The latter, thanks to his X platform, openly promote the spread of fake news and reactionary propaganda on an unprecedented industrial scale. Goebbels said that a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes the truth, but with X and social media in general, socially planned lies take on a new quality thanks to the effective monopoly of the tech giants of the industry. Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg are not only at the top of the vertical accumulation of capital, they also possess a power historically unprecedented for individuals, the power to lie on an historical universal scale. Curiously, although Donald Trump probably has no idea that Nick Land or Curtis Jerven exist, he is implementing neo-reactionary ideas by choosing a cabinet of billionaires led by Elon Musk and effectively expanding the power of the executive branch in just a few weeks in office. The Dark Enlightenment is not a crazy idea of philosophical geeks. On contrary, it is an intrinsic trend of the crisis of late capitalism and the new configuration of capitalist governance on a global scale. If we look at the rampant rise of Donald Trump to a second term, support by the not so passive complicity of the criminals against humanity in Joe Biden's Democratic administration, the ideas of Curtis Jarvin and Nick Land about the entropic tendencies of democracy as a historically obsolete form of capitalist rule do not seem so crazy. The emerging historical phase of global capital thus tends to render the ultra-left critique of democracy obsolete, since it is capital itself and not international revolution that tends to historically overcome democracy. An example of this is the rapid dismantling of the very international budgets and institutions agreed upon by the conflicted capitalist nations and the end of the Second World War. Today, there is open talk of using nuclear weapons, of the open and indiscriminate murder of civilians as a military target, of the need to revoke human rights as a supranational legal framework, among other things. The genocide in Gaza, where children are deliberately shot and entire refugee camps are vaporized with bombs guided by artificial intelligence, amongst other horrors typical of this era, is the paradigm of the immediate future of capitalist civilization and direct testimony to the new geopolitical configurations of global capitalism. In this sense, the genocide in Gaza is, together with Trump's second rise, a clear moment in the qualitative transformation of the current process of capital and the beginning of a new historical phase of capitalist civilization, marked by the barbarization of capitalism on a global scale. From a critical perspective, the moment of truth in the philosophy of the Dark Enlightenment lies in its diagnosis of the acceleration of capital as a process that necessarily involves the intensified exploitation of humanity and nature, the dismantling of the legal structures of neoliberal capitalism, the development of new forms of warfare, and the active elimination of population deemed undesirable. However, its analysis loses sight of the fact that this acceleration is not an autonomous force, but the result of the logic of capital valorization, which is now facing its own historical limits. In this sense, the Dark Enlightenment is not a break with capitalist modernity, but a necessary development of this mode of production under the condition of its structural crisis. But where does this structural crisis of capitalism come from? The answer is from its own scientific and technological development. Technological acceleration, especially in automation and artificial intelligence, has dramatically reduced the need for human labor in the immediate production process. But the exploitation of human labor is the foundation of capital accumulation. This phenomenon, known as the tendency of the proportion of living labor in the production of value to fall, generates a structural crisis. By reducing its dependence on human labor, capital destroys the very basis of its valorization. However, this is only an objective tendency of the process, which is counteracted by the development of capital itself. The way in which this objective tendency toward a decrease in the global mass of surplus value is resolved is through the intensified exploitation of the productive proletariat. Hence, the increasingly accelerated competition between the largest contemporary neo-imperialism, the United States and China, should develop the infrastructures, science, and technology necessary for the development of artificial intelligence. This technology, within the framework of capitalism relations, far from leading humanity to the emancipation of labor, will mean the possibility of even more brutal exploitation of the living labor of humanity. In fact, it is already done so. On the other hand, given this condition of accelerated techno-scientific development applied to the immediate process of commodity production, the perpetuation of capital accumulation takes on increasingly repressive characteristics that tends toward the barbarization of capitalist social relations. Given the partially superfluous nature for capital of huge sector of the world proletariat, the intensified exploitation of labor goes hand in hand with exacerbated competition for access to precariously poorly paid jobs with constantly declining rights. On the other hand, this reality is intersecting with a racial stratification of the proletariat, increasingly evident within the industrially advanced nations of the West, which receive large migratory masses fleeing extremely adverse conditions in their countries of origin and who are required by the needs of certain industries that needs cheap and rightless labor to exploit. The capital relationship between capital and the wage earning class is becoming increasingly repressive, with the rise of misery amid the most astonishing abundance. Cities must be militarized and the police armed to the teeth, not to defend the population, of course, but in preparation for the inevitable daily revolt that takes on criminal overtones, and also for the capture of human material to be sent to the expanded prison of the system. Capital combats the misery it's produced with its own means, which also involves manhunts. In the USA, this hunt is directly, especially against migrant populations who are deported in chains to their countries of origin and stored in perfectly legal concentration camps, as in the past with the slavery or the racial laws of the Third Reich. This nationalist delirium, on which the global neo-reactionary wave is based, is precisely a response to these conditions, in which the crisis of the global relation push the middle class and the proletariat into the terror of being cut off from access to social wealth. People are thus objects of exploitation by a system that they nevertheless reproduce as subjects. Herein lies the terrible dialectic of the current perpetuation of the system, but also the possibility of its overcoming. In conclusion, Trump is a symptom of the geopolitical reconfiguration of global capitalism in the context of the socio-ecological crisis of the system and the decomposition of the global order that has prevailed since the end of the Cold War. As such, it represents the objective needs of the system to reproduce itself amid the crisis, which means a reconfiguration of the areas of US imperial influence pushed by the rise of the other emerging powers such as China and, more broadly, the BRICS countries. In Ukraine, the old alliance between the USA and Western Europe is crumbling. This is a direct result of the contradiction of the capitalist crisis, as the USA urgently needs to cut as much surplus value as possible from its former allies, while revitalizing its domestic industry, which is threatened by China's rise. If Europe wants to stay afloat as a bloc of capitalist nations, it will have to rearm and implement draconian measures similar to those of the United States, which is already evident in the rise of the far right in Europe. On the other hand, I have repeatedly pointed out in other writings that Gaza is the world, because there the destructive logic of the crisis is radicalized. The planned elimination of superfluous proletarian population not only responds to geostrategic interests, but also to the need to maintain a global system where the lives of the dispossessed are managed as waste. Gaza is the dark mirror of the late capitalism, an area where technological progress coexists with absolute deshumanization, where drones and algorithms carry out orders of extermination, while the rest of the world watch with indifference or impotence. A permanent life in pain. Gaza is a global laboratory of desensitization, where people are trained to accept the crushing demands of the sacrificial perpetuation of the system, a laboratory that is already spreading throughout the world and constitute the exact image of the near future of capitalist civilization. Faced with this situation, which is truly desperate if we think about it from the perspective of those whose lives are directly threatened with falling under the wheels of the sacrificial chariot of capitalist imperialism, our first task is to organize the struggle within our immediate sphere of influence. This implies the need for a reactivation of radical criticisms in the face of the new conditions of the present historical stage of capitalist civilization, but also the formation of a historical movement capable of acting strategically within the framework of this process. Today, our immediate mission is to build an historical alternative. This task cannot be the work of isolated individuals writing on blogs or journals for a select audience. Although this work may be necessary for the dissemination of radical perspective in the adverse conditions imposed by the capitalist crisis, this work, however, is a task that belongs to a critically updated radical movement. At present, radical social transformation seems to be blocked, although the risings in different parts of the world shed light on the possibility of something different emerging. However, without radical critique and the formation of a movement with radical perspectives, the struggles, however important they may be, will not go beyond the frameworks of capitalist socialization. To radically understand capitalist society and its current historical moment is, in this sense, one of the basic conditions for the development of what will be different. That said, it's not enough only to understand the ongoing catastrophe, but it is also necessary to evidence the rational possibility of hope, which indeed nest in the fact that we are still alive and that we can still oppose the road to complete barbarism. The critique of society is incomplete if it is not capable of offering a strategic perspective, but that can only happen within the framework of a broader movement. In any case, with the rise of Donald Trump and Elon Musk to the throne of the greatest capitalist empire, a new historical era of the crisis of capital has begun that will bring intensified exploitation, terror, and death throughout the world. Welcome to the times of the Dark Enlightenment. With this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.